The morning of October 16, 1978 arrived cold and clear over Fairfield County, Iowa. Eleanor Bradford woke at 5, same as she had for 32 years, but Will's side of the bed stayed empty. The sheets held no warmth. She'd made them up fresh the day before, hospital corners tight because people would come back to the house after. People always came back after. She dressed in the Navy suit she'd bought in Cedar Rapids 3 days ago. The clerk had been kind, not asking questions, when a 54-year-old woman bought funeral clothes in early autumn. Ellie's hands shook fastening the buttons. 7 months. From diagnosis to death, Will had lasted 214 days. Pancreatic cancer didn't negotiate. It took what it wanted and left nothing but paperwork and casseroles. The First Methodist Church sat on Elm Street, white clapboard, with a bell tower that had called this town to worship since 1903. Ellie arrived early before the funeral director finished arranging flowers. Lilies everywhere, lilies, their smell thick enough to choke on. The October sun cut through stained glass, throwing colored light across empty pews. In 3 hours those pews would fill. Will Bradford had farmed this county for 34 years. People remembered men who helped without asking, who fixed neighbors' equipment at midnight, who never mentioned what they were owed. The casket sat closed. Ellie had seen enough of cancer's work. She wanted to remember Will as he'd been in March, before the diagnosis, before the weight loss turned him skeletal, before morphine replaced conversation. She touched the polished wood, once pulled her hand back. The surface felt cold. 237 people came. Ellie counted without meaning to her mind, latching onto numbers because numbers made sense when nothing else did. Garrett arrived first, her oldest son, 26, and uncomfortable in a suit that didn't fit right across the shoulders. He'd driven from Des Moines that morning, left at 4 to make it on time. His eyes were dry, but his jaw worked constantly, grinding back whatever he wouldn't let surface. Clare came next, 23, and already crying. She'd been crying since hospice, since the morphine drip, since the moment Will stopped recognizing faces. She held Ellie's hand through the first hymn, squeezed so hard the bones ached. Lucas sat on Ellie's other side, 19 years old and silent. He stared straight ahead, shoulders rigid, refusing to bend even when Pastor Ruth Whitmore spoke about dust returning to dust. Franklin Bradford arrived 20 minutes late. Ellie heard the church door creak, heard the shuffled footsteps, knew without looking. Frank was 62, Will's older brother, the one who'd left farming for a hardware store in town 30 years back. He slid into a rear pew with his wife Diane and her husband Charles. They didn't come forward to sit with family. Ellie felt their absence like a draft from an open window. Pastor Ruth spoke about Will's life. 34 years farming the same 320 acres his grandfather had homesteaded. 2 tours fixing engines in Korea, came home and never mentioned the war. Married Eleanor Hayes in 1946, built a life that meant something beyond profit margins. Raised 3 children who knew what work meant. Kept his word even when keeping it cost him. The congregation sang Amazing Grace, and Ellie's throat closed. Will had sung that song off-key every Sunday for 32 years, confident and terrible. She'd teased him about it just last month, back when teasing still made sense, back when next month seemed possible. Now the voices around her blurred together, and she couldn't separate one from another, couldn't find the melody through the weight in her chest. The cemetery sat 2 miles outside town, Bradford family plot going back to 1901. Will's grandfather lay there, his father and infant sister who died in 1918. The autumn wind cut across open ground corn stubble in surrounding fields already harvested. Someone had set up a green tent over the grave. The funeral director gestured for family to sit. Ellie remained standing. She'd sat enough in hospital rooms, sat enough watching Will fade. Standing meant she could still hold herself together. Pastor Ruth read from Ecclesiastes. To everything a season, a time to be born, and a time to die. The words washed over Ellie without landing. They lowered the casket on canvas straps, machinery clicking as it descended. Clare sobbed into Garrett's shoulder. Lucas kept his eyes on the horizon, watching distant tree lines, like something out there might make sense of this. Frank and Diane left before the final prayer. Ellie watched them go, saw Frank check his watch, saw them hurry toward their car like men running from rain. They'd flown in last night, would fly back tomorrow. Frank's hardware store couldn't spare him longer. At least that's what he'd told Garrett on the phone. Will had lain dying in hospice for 2 weeks, and Frank had visited once, stayed 20 minutes left when conversation faltered. People came back to the Bradford farmhouse after. Women filled the kitchen with dishes wrapped in foil labeled with masking tape. Tuna casserole, green bean bake ham, and scalloped potatoes, 3 different Jell-O salads. The dining table disappeared under food. The counter overflowed. These women knew the language of grief, knew that feeding the bereaved gave them something to do when words failed. The house smelled like other people's kitchens. Ellie stood in her own living room feeling like a guest. Neighbors offered condolences in low voices, said things like, "If you need anything," and "We're here for you," and all the other phrases that meant well and helped nothing. Sam Tucker appeared at some point, a 47-year-old farmer from the next section over, weathered and quiet. He gripped Ellie's hand once hard. His eyes were the only thing he offered. Besides silence, "I know what this is. I've been here. You'll survive it even when you don't want to." He'd lost his wife 3 years back. Cancer, too. Different kind. Same ending. By 8 o'clock, everyone had left except Ellie's children. They sat around the kitchen table, the same oak table Will had built in 1952 from lumber he'd milled himself. His coffee cup still sat in the dish rack where Ellie had washed it 4 days ago. She hadn't been able to put it away. The cup was brown ceramic, chipped on the rim, 30 years old. Will had drunk from it every morning, black coffee so strong it could strip paint. Garrett spoke first, his engineer's mind already organizing what came next. His voice came out careful, like he'd rehearsed this. "Mom, we need to talk about what happens now." Ellie looked at her oldest son. 26 years old, good job in Des Moines apartment he shared with another engineer, life built separate from this farm. "What do you mean?" "The farm. 320 acres, the equipment, the house, all of it. We need to figure out what you're going to do." "I'm going to keep farming it." Silence fell like someone had cut the sound. Clare stopped twisting her napkin. Lucas looked up from the table. Garrett's face did something complicated. Clare spoke next, her teacher's instinct to gentle things kicking in. "Mom, you're 54 years old. You've never farmed alone. Dad did all the field work." Ellie felt something harden in her chest, something that had been soft with grief turning sharp. "I know how to farm. I've been on this land 32 years. I know every field, every piece of equipment, everything that needs doing." Garrett leaned forward, his practical nature pushing past sentiment. "But can you physically do it? Running a tractor 12 hours a day, maintaining equipment, hauling grain?" "Mom, it's not that we don't think you're capable." "Then what is it?" The words came out harder than she meant. Garrett flinched. Clare reached across the table, but Ellie pulled her hand back. Lucas finally spoke, his 19-year-old bluntness cutting through the careful dance. "We're worried you're going to work yourself to death trying to keep this place going out of stubbornness." "This isn't stubbornness. This is my home. This is what your father and I built together." Garrett tried again, softer. "No one said you have to sell. But maybe you could lease it out, let someone else farm it. You'd still own the land, still get income, but you wouldn't have to do the work. Your father and I never leased our land to anyone. We farmed it ourselves." "Dad's gone, Mom." The words hit like a fist. Garrett looked immediately sorry, but didn't take them back. Ellie stood up, her chair scraping against linoleum. "I know exactly where your father is. I put him in the ground this morning. But this farm is still here, and I'm still here, and I'm not giving up on it because it's hard." She walked to the bedroom, closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed. Will would never sleep in again. Through the walls she heard her children's voices muffled, discussing her like she was the problem to solve. Claire's voice rose defensive. Lucas's voice stayed flat. Garrett's voice carried his engineer's certainty that there was a right answer if they just found the correct formula. Ellie stared at Will's empty dresser. He'd kept his things neat, folded work shirts stacked by color socks, paired and rolled. She'd have to deal with all of it eventually. Box it up, donate it, make the physical fact of his absence complete. But not tonight. Tonight she had nothing left. She lay down on top of the covers, still in her funeral suit, and closed her eyes. Sleep wouldn't come, but she could pretend. Pretend she wasn't 54 and alone. Pretend 320 acres of Iowa farmland wasn't sitting out there waiting for someone to work it. Pretend her children weren't in the kitchen planning her future like she'd already failed. Tuesday morning arrived at 5. Ellie's alarm went off, same time it had gone off for 32 years. She lay there for 10 seconds, then swung her legs out of bed. The floor was cold. October mornings in Iowa carried the first bite of winter. She made coffee in the pot Will had used, measured the grounds the way he'd taught her back in '46 when she was a farm wife who didn't know corn from soybeans. The coffee was too strong bitter enough to make her eyes water. Perfect. She sat at the kitchen table alone. Will's chair stood empty across from her. For 32 years he'd sat there every morning, newspaper spread in front of him, commenting on grain prices and weather forecasts and which fields needed attention. Now the chair just sat, wood and air, nothing more. Ellie gave herself 10 minutes. 10 minutes to cry, to break down, to let the grief have its way. Then she wiped her eyes, drank the rest of her coffee, and walked out to the machine shed. The morning smelled like diesel and old wood, and the particular scent of Iowa autumn, something between dry leaves and distant rain. The machine shed stood where Will's grandfather had built it in 1923, expanded twice, roof patched so many times the original shingles had disappeared under layers of repair. Inside, equipment lined up like soldiers. 1968, John Deere 4020, 1974, 4430, with its enclosed cab grain, drill disc, Harrow moldboard plow. All of it maintained meticulously because Will couldn't stand sloppy work. Ellie had driven these tractors before. Not often, not recently, but enough to remember. She'd helped with harvest when extra hands were needed, hauled grain to the elevator, worked fields when Will was short-handed. That had been years ago, back when her body didn't ache from standing too long, back when 12-hour days seemed manageable instead of impossible. She climbed onto the 4430. The cab smelled like diesel and old coffee and Will. His thermos still sat in the holder, half full, 4 days old. Ellie's hand hovered over it, then moved to the ignition. The key turned and the engine roared to life, that deep diesel rumble that said power and work and purpose. She let it warm up, remembering Will's voice. Give her 5 minutes. Ellie, cold engine'll tear itself apart. Hooking up the disc harrow took an hour. The pins were stiff winter rust, making them reluctant. Ellie's hands cramped, wrestling them into place. Sweat soaked through her work shirt despite the cold. Finally, the harrow locked into position, chains secured, hydraulics connected. She drove the tractor out of the shed across the farmyard toward the east 40 acres. The field stretched flat, and empty corn stubble from last harvest still standing. Will had planned to disc this field in late September, get it ready for winter wheat. Cancer had stopped that plan. Now the field sat waiting, patient, as land always was ready for whoever would work it. Ellie dropped the harrow, engaged, the hydraulics started across the field. The tractor pulled hard, engine settling into its working rhythm. The harrow bit into earth, turning stubble under breaking up compacted soil. Diesel fumes rolled into the cab despite the seals. The seat vibrated with engine noise. Back and forth, cutting passes across 40 acres of Bradford land. Her back started aching after 2 hours. Her hands cramped on the steering wheel after 3. By noon her whole body screamed for rest, but the field was only half done. She pushed through, made herself keep going because stopping meant admitting this was too much. The tractor didn't care about grief or age or whether a 54-year-old widow could handle field work. The tractor just pulled, turned methodical as seasons. At 2 o'clock, Ellie finished the East 40. She drove back to the farmyard, parked the tractor, shut off the engine. Silence crashed down after 8 hours of diesel roar. She climbed down from the cab, legs shaking, and nearly fell. Her knees didn't want to hold her. She made it to the porch, collapsed on the steps, sat there breathing hard. But the field was done. 40 acres disked, ready for wheat. She'd done that, alone with equipment that scared her children, with a body that wasn't young anymore. She'd done it. Wednesday she did it again. Different field, same process. Wake up, coffee, tractor, field work until exhausted. Come home, collapse. The south 60 acres took longer because the terrain rolled, making the harrow work harder. Ellie's back felt like someone had taken a hammer to her spine. Her hands developed blisters that burst and bled and formed calluses over the raw skin. She lost 6 pounds in 3 days' weight. She couldn't afford to lose her clothes hanging looser than they should. Sam Tucker stopped by Wednesday afternoon. Ellie was in the machine shed checking oil levels on the 4020 when she heard his truck. She came out wiping grease off her hands. Sam stood in the farmyard looking at the disked fields, at Ellie covered in dust and diesel stains, at the evidence that someone was working this land hard. His face stayed neutral, but his eyes saw everything. "Fields look good, Ellie. Thank you. You doing all this yourself?" "I am." He nodded slowly, considering something. Then he looked at her directly, no pretense. "I saw Frank in town yesterday. He was asking questions." Ellie's stomach dropped. "What kind of questions?" "About the farm. How it looked, whether you were keeping up with work, whether you seemed capable. I told him the fields looked better than half the farms in the county, and he should mind his own business." "Thank you for that." Sam shifted his weight, uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "Ellie, I don't know what Will's brother is planning, but he's watching you, waiting for something. You should know that." After Sam left, Ellie stood in the farmyard alone, looking at the machine shed, at the fields she'd worked, at the house where she'd lived 32 years. Frank was watching. That meant Frank was planning. That meant Friday was coming, and whatever Frank wanted, it wasn't going to be good. Thursday. Ellie worked through pain that made her vision blur. The west 45 acres needed disking before winter wheat could go in. She started at dawn, worked through breakfast, through lunch, through the afternoon. Her hands cramped so badly on the steering wheel she had to pry them loose when she stopped. Her back spasmed every time she shifted position. But the field got done, all 45 acres turned and ready. She came home at dusk, parked. The tractor staggered into the house. The phone was ringing. She grabbed it without checking who was calling. Garrett's voice came through tight with something Ellie couldn't read. "Mom, I found something in Dad's papers." Her heart lurched. "What kind of something?" "We need to talk. I'll drive down this weekend. Don't make any decisions until we talk." "Garrett, what did you find?" But he'd already hung up. Ellie stood holding the phone, listening to dial tone, feeling the week's exhaustion crash over her all at once. 4 days of farming alone. 4 days proving she could do this. And now Garrett had found something in Will's papers that required a face-to-face conversation. That night, Ellie dreamed about debt collectors and foreclosure notices and losing the farm, not to her inability, but to something Will had hidden. She woke up at 3, couldn't get back to sleep, lay in the dark, listening to the house settle and wondering what her husband had left unsaid. Friday morning arrived cold and bright. Ellie was in the machine shed doing maintenance on the 4020 when she heard vehicles in the driveway, 3 of them, engines cutting off one after another. She came out of the shed, wiping grease off her hands, her work clothes stained with diesel and dirt, her body still aching from 4 days of field work. Frank Bradford got out of a Chevy pickup first. 62 years old, soft around the middle, wearing clean clothes that had never seen farm work. Diane stepped out of a sedan, second 59, and uncomfortable, her eyes not quite meeting Ellie's. A third man emerged from a Continental suit and briefcase, stranger's face with a professional smile. Ellie's stomach went cold. Frank walked toward her, his expression carefully neutral. "Ellie, you're looking tired. How are you holding up?" "Fine. What brings you out here, Frank?" "We need to talk. Can we go inside?" Ellie looked at the man in the suit, at the briefcase, at Diane's discomfort. "Who's he?" "This is Douglas Reinhardt. He's a real estate agent. Specializes in farm sales." The words hit like cold water. Ellie felt her jaw tighten. "Why is a real estate agent here?" Frank's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Can we please go inside?" They sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Ellie had buried her husband 5 days ago, the same table where her children had expressed their concern. Now Frank and Diane sat where her kids had sat, and Douglas Reinhardt pulled papers from his briefcase like he was about to solve everyone's problems. Frank started talking before Ellie could offer coffee, before she could establish any control over this conversation. "Ellie, we've been talking the family and we think it's time to sell the farm. This isn't your decision to make." "Actually," Frank said carefully, "it partially is." Douglas Reinhardt slid papers across the table. Legal documents, dense text signatures at the bottom. Ellie's eyes couldn't focus on the words. Her heart was pounding too hard. "Mrs. Bradford, according to these documents from the county recorder, while you inherit the property, there's a partnership agreement dating back to 1962. When William and his siblings inherited this farm from their father, they established equal ownership. William bought out portions over the years, but according to these records, Frank and Diane still own 35% combined." Ellie stared at the papers, at the signatures, at legal language that made her head spin. "That's not true. Will told me he bought them out completely in '68. Frank shifted uncomfortably. "He bought the house and primary acreage, but there's 112 acres still under partnership agreement, and the partnership rules state any major decision requires majority vote." "Will never mentioned this." Diane spoke for the first time, her voice soft. "Maybe he didn't want to worry you. Maybe he planned to finish the buyout. But Eleanor, he's gone now, and legally we have a say in what happens to this land." Douglas Reinhardt pulled out more papers, market analysis and property valuations and numbers that made Ellie's vision blur. "We have a buyer already, Age Corp Holdings out of Illinois. They're interested in acquiring the property. They're offering $485,000. That's $20,000 over market value." The number hung in the air. $485,000 for 320 acres of land, for the house where Ellie had lived 32 years, for the machine shed and the equipment and the fields she'd just spent 4 days proving she could work. Frank leaned forward, his tone reasonable, like he was doing her a favor. "Ellie, your share would be $315,000. That's enough to buy a nice house in town, live comfortably, never worry about money again. I already live comfortably on my farm. It's not just your farm." Diane's voice came out quiet but firm. "It's the Bradford family farm. Will's grandfather broke this ground in 1901. It's been family land 77 years. If it has to be sold, the family should benefit." Ellie's hands clenched under the table. "I am family. I've been Eleanor Bradford since 1946. You know what I mean. Blood family." The words landed like a slap. Ellie stood up, her chair scraping against linoleum. "I buried my husband 5 days ago. 5 days. And you show up with a real estate agent and papers and plans to sell my home out from under me." Frank stood too, his face flushing. "We're trying to help you before you hurt yourself. You're 54 years old. You can't run 320 acres alone. Will could barely manage it the last few years. How long do you think you can keep this up?" "As long as I need to." "Be realistic, Ellie. Winter wheat needs planting in 3 weeks. Spring planting after that. Summer maintenance, fall harvest. You'll work yourself to death trying to prove something that doesn't need proving." Douglas Reinhardt cleared his throat. "Mrs. Bradford, the family has already contacted Ag Corp. They're very interested. This is an excellent opportunity." "I don't care about opportunities. This is my home." Frank's voice hardened. "The partnership agreement is legal. We're invoking that clause. We want to sell and you can't stop us. Get out of my house. Ellie," her voice came out cold and final. "Get out, all of you, now." They left, but Douglas Reinhardt left his business card on the table. As they walked out, Frank turned back one last time. "We'll give you 2 weeks to think it over. But this is happening, Ellie, with or without your cooperation. Talk to a lawyer if you don't believe us." Then they were gone. Vehicles starting up gravel, crunching under tires, silence falling over the farmyard like snow. Ellie stood in her kitchen shaking with anger and fear and the sudden crushing weight of understanding that this fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. She looked at the business card on the table, looked at Will's empty chair, looked out the window at 320 acres of Bradford land that might not be hers at all. Then she went to the phone and started making calls. Garrett answered on the second ring. "They what?" Ellie's voice came out steadier than she felt. Partnership agreement from 62. Frank says he and Diane own 35%. Says they can force a sale. Mom, did you know about this? Your father said he bought them out in 68. I saw papers, or I thought I did. Garrett's voice went tight. There's something else. That thing I found in Dad's papers. It's a bank statement. Mom, the farm has an $85,000 note with First National, due February 1st. The floor tilted under Ellie's feet. She gripped the phone hard enough to hurt. That's impossible. We paid off the land in 72. Equipment's clear. The loan's dated March 78. Same month Dad was diagnosed. He took it out without telling you. Ellie's mind went blank, then raced. March. Will had borrowed $85,000 the same month cancer showed up. Medical bills. He'd borrowed against the farm to pay for treatment, and he'd never told her. How much do we owe total? The statement shows $72,000 still outstanding, with interest probably more now. $72,000. Partnership dispute. Frank watching her fail. Ellie felt the walls closing in. I'm coming home this weekend. We need to see a lawyer. After Garrett hung up, Ellie called Clare. Her daughter's voice came through, already crying. How dare they? They didn't even visit Dad in hospice. Honey, I need you to be calm. Can you come home Saturday? I'm coming tonight. Mom, you can't fight this alone. Lucas answered his dorm phone on the fifth ring, voice thick with sleep. I'll drop out. Come home and help. No, you stay in school. This is my fight. It's our farm too. And I'll protect it. But you finish your degree. Promise me. He promised, reluctant, angry, wanting to do something when there was nothing he could do. Ellie hung up the phone and stood in her kitchen in the house where she'd lived 32 years, looking at the evidence of Will's secrets. Partnership agreements he'd never finished dissolving. Bank loans he'd hidden. Medical debt that had eaten their savings and then bitten deeper into the land itself, into the future he'd thought he'd have time to fix. She went to Will's office, pulled open the filing cabinet, started searching. Under bank documents, she found it loan agreement $85,000 at 6% interest, due February 1st, 1979. 4 months away. Will's signature at the bottom, dated March 15th, same week he'd gotten the diagnosis. Deeper in the file, she found hospital bills. $107,000 for 7 months of treatment. Chemotherapy that didn't work, radiation that bought weeks, hospice care that made dying bearable. The insurance had covered some, not enough, never enough. Will had borrowed $85,000 to pay what insurance wouldn't. At the very back of the file, folded small, she found a note in Will's handwriting. Ellie, I'm sorry. I thought I'd beat this. I thought I'd have time to explain. The mineral rights sale fell through. I couldn't let you know how bad it was. Love, W. Ellie read it 3 times, then folded it back up and put it away. Will had protected her from the truth, hidden the debt, hidden the danger, and now she stood alone with the consequences. $72,000 due in 4 months. Partnership dispute with Frank and Diane. 320 acres of land she might lose, not because she couldn't farm it, but because her husband had tried to save his own life. She sat at Will's desk until dark, then went to bed without eating. Sleep came in fragments, nightmares about foreclosure and auction notices and strangers farming Bradford land. Sunday morning, Ellie went to church. She hadn't missed a Sunday service in 32 years, and grief wouldn't change that. The First Methodist Church looked the same as always, white-clapboard and stained-glass bell tower calling the faithful. Ellie walked in and felt eyes on her, felt the whole congregation aware of the widow in the front pew alone now, where she'd always sat with Will. Pastor Ruth Whitmore stood at the pulpit, 60-something, and steady gray hair pulled back, voice carrying without strain. The sermon was about trials, about faith, tested, about Job losing everything and keeping his dignity. Ellie wondered if Pastor Ruth knew if word had already spread through a small town that Frank Bradford was trying to force his brother's widow to sell. After the service, people gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee and conversation. Women from the auxiliary surrounded Ellie, offered support in the way church women did, practical and steady. Sam Tucker appeared with his wife Martha, both of them quiet, both of them nodding when Ellie thanked them for coming to the funeral. Pastor Ruth pulled Ellie aside, her hand gentle on Ellie's arm. "I heard Frank was out at your place Friday." Small towns kept no secrets. Ellie nodded. "He wants me to sell." "What do you want?" "I want to keep farming, but he says there's a partnership agreement. Says he has legal standing." Pastor Ruth's face stayed calm, but her eyes sharpened. "Do you have a good lawyer?" "I'm seeing Henry Morrison tomorrow." "Good. Henry's honest. He'll tell you the truth, even when the truth is hard." She paused, measuring her words. "The church is here for you, Eleanor, whatever you need. You've been part of this community 32 years. That means something." Sam Tucker approached as Pastor Ruth moved away to greet other parishioners. He stood beside Ellie, not quite looking at her, his farmer's discomfort with emotion showing. "Martha and I talked. If you need help with the farm, I can spare some hours. No charge." Ellie's throat tightened. "Sam, I can't ask you to work for free." "You're not asking. I'm offering. Will helped me when Martha died. Paid for half the funeral, never asked for it back. When my combine broke down during harvest in '76, he lent me his, worked my fields alongside his own. I owe that man." "You don't owe me." His eyes finally met hers, steady and certain. "Yes, I do. Debt doesn't die with the debtor." Monday morning, Ellie drove to Fairfield to the office of Henry Morrison, attorney at law. The building sat on Main Street, brick and old wood law books lining the walls. Morrison was 71, semi-retired, but he'd handled Bradford family legal work since 1954. He stood when Ellie entered, gestured to a chair, his face already grave. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry for your loss. Will was a fine man." "Thank you, Henry. I need your help." "I know. Frank called me last week. Wanted to know about the partnership agreement." Ellie felt her stomach drop. "Is it real?" Morrison pulled a thick file from his desk, opened it, showed her documents dating back to 1962. "It's real. When Will's father died, the 3 siblings inherited equally. 106 acres each total, 318 acres plus the 2-acre homestead. Will bought the homestead and 206 acres over the years. Frank owns 68 acres, Diane owns 44. Legally, this is still a partnership. But I thought Will bought them out completely." "He told you that?" "In '68. Said it was done." Morrison's face showed something like pity. He intended to, but he never finished. Legally, this is still a partnership. Any sale requires majority vote that's over 50% ownership. You own 208 acres through Will's estate. Frank and Diane own 112 combined. They can't force a sale on their own, but they can block you from selling if you wanted to." Ellie leaned forward. "What about the loan Garrett found, an $85,000 note due February 1st? Morrison nodded slowly. "Will took that out in March. $72,000 remains outstanding. If you default, First National can foreclose. Once foreclosure proceedings begin, partnership rules allow minority owners to petition for immediate sale to satisfy debts. So if I can't pay the loan, Frank can force a sale anyway." "Exactly." The office went quiet. Outside Fairfield went about its Monday business, people shopping and working and living normal lives, while Ellie's world collapsed inward. "Henry, what are my options?" "Option 1. Negotiate with Frank and Diane. Sell the farm, pay the debts, split the proceeds. You'd clear about $280,000 after everything." "No." Option 2. Find $72,000 before February 1st. Refinance or pay cash. Keep farming. But you'd still have the partnership dispute. "How do I resolve the partnership?" "Buy out Frank and Diane's shares. Based on current valuation, that's about $156,000 for their 112 acres. Total, you'd need about $240,000 to own the farm free and clear." Ellie laughed, bitter and short. "I don't have $240,000. Then option 3, court battle. Argue the partnership agreement is void somehow, or that Frank and Diane forfeited their shares through abandonment. But Eleanor, litigation is expensive and unpredictable, and you still have to pay the bank debt either way." Morrison leaned back, his old lawyer's face showing decades of delivering bad news. My honest counsel farm this land impeccably. Document everything. Show you can manage it. Meanwhile, I'll research the partnership agreement for any loopholes. But Eleanor, you're in a difficult position. Ellie stood, her legs shaky but holding. I'm not selling, Henry. I'll find a way. Outside Morrison's office, Fairfield looked the same as always. Main Street running through town, hardware store and diner and post office, people going about their lives. Ellie walked to her truck, climbed in, sat behind the wheel, not moving. $72,000 due in less than 4 months. Partnership dispute with no clear resolution. 320 acres of land that might not survive her husband's death. She started the truck and drove home, back to the farm, where she'd spent 32 years, where 4 days of field work sat as evidence that she could do this, where Will's empty chair waited at the kitchen table. The afternoon sun slanted across harvested fields, corn stubble casting long shadows. The machine shed stood solid and permanent. The house held 3 decades of memories in every board. Ellie parked in the farmyard and sat looking at it all. Her home, her life. Everything Frank wanted to take and sell to strangers who'd never loved this land, who'd never bled into this soil, who'd see only dollars per acre instead of legacy. She got out of the truck and walked to the machine shed. The tractors sat waiting, patient as the land itself. She climbed onto the 4430, didn't start it, just sat in the cab breathing diesel fumes and old coffee and the particular smell of work waiting to be done. Through the windshield she could see the East 40 disked and ready, the South 60 turned and waiting for seed, the West 45 prepared for winter wheat. 4 days of work. 4 days of proving she could do this, and now she had less than 4 months to save it all. Garrett and Clare arrived Saturday morning, their cars pulling into the farmyard minutes apart. Lucas drove up from Iowa State that afternoon, all 3 of them gathering because crisis demanded family. They sat in the living room this time, not the kitchen, as if changing locations might change the situation. Garrett had brought files, financial records spread across the coffee table like evidence at trial. Claire's eyes were red from crying during the drive. Lucas looked ready to punch something. Ellie spoke first, her voice carrying none of the exhaustion she felt. Henry Morrison confirmed everything. The partnership is real. Frank owns 68 acres, Diane owns 44. The loan is real. $72,000 due February 1st. Garrett's engineering mind went straight to numbers. 4 months. We need options. I have $12,000 in savings. Clare. Claire's voice came out small. 8,000. I was saving for a house. Lucas shifted uncomfortably. I've got maybe 2,000. Student loans don't leave much. 22,000 between them. Ellie shook her head. That's not enough, and you know it. Even if we pay down the loan, we'd still need money to buy out Frank and Diane. We'd need another 156,000 for their shares. So we're looking at 178,000 total. Garrett's face showed his calculations failing. Mom, where are we going to get that kind of money? I don't know, but I'm not selling. Clare leaned forward, her teacher's instinct to solve problems kicking in. What about a second mortgage or refinancing? Henry said banks don't see 54-year-old widows as good risks, especially ones farming alone. The room fell silent. Outside, November wind rattled the windows. Winter was coming, and with it the deadline that would determine everything. Lucas spoke up, his 19-year-old certainty cutting through the careful adult conversation. Then we hire help. Show the bank you're not farming alone. Show Frank you can manage this operation. With what money, we can barely afford the loan payment. We help. Garrett's voice carried the weight of a decision already made. The 3 of us. We pitch in to pay a farmhand's salary until the farm can support it. Ellie stood up, her whole body rejecting the idea. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. Claire's voice came out firm. We're telling you this is what we're doing. You can argue or you can accept it, but we're helping either way. Sam Tucker came by Monday morning, his truck appearing in the driveway like he'd been summoned. Ellie met him in the farmyard, the November cold biting through her coat. His face showed he already knew what she needed to ask. I heard your kids were in town this weekend. Word travels fast. Always does. Ellie, I meant what I said. I can help. She looked at this man who'd lost his own wife 3 years back, who understood what it meant to keep going when everything said stop. I can pay $500 a month. That's all the farm can afford right now. That's half what other operations pay. I know, but my kids are covering part of it until we're profitable. Sam, I need someone who knows farming who can do the heavy work while I manage the books and coordinate. This isn't charity. It's partnership. Sam extended his hand, calloused and strong. $500 a month. I handle fieldwork, equipment operation, anything that needs doing. You run the business. They shook on it. No contracts, no lawyers, just two farmers agreeing to keep land working. When do I start? Now. Winter wheat needs planting, and I need someone who won't break the equipment trying to prove a point. His mouth twitched almost a smile. Will mentioned you had a stubborn streak. Will didn't know the half of it. The first week with Sam showed Ellie how much she'd been trying to do alone. He arrived at dawn, worked until dusk, handled equipment with the ease of someone who'd spent 47 years understanding machinery. The winter wheat went in across 80 acres, planted on time, done right. Sam didn't talk much, but his presence filled the gaps Will had left, not replacing her husband, but standing where help was needed. Ellie's body thanked her for the reprieve. Her back stopped its constant ache. Her hands began to heal. She could focus on bookkeeping, coordinating custom farming contracts, managing the business side while Sam handled physical labor that would have destroyed her. But $500 a month drained their account faster than she'd expected. The November payment went through barely. December loomed with its loan installment and operating costs, and the reality that winter didn't stop demanding money just because someone had died. The first snow fell the second week of November, light dusting that melted by noon. By Thanksgiving, 6 inches blanketed the fields. Garrett came home for the holiday, spent it reviewing financial projections that showed negative cash flow through spring. Claire drove in Thursday morning, stayed through the weekend, helping Ellie organize tax documents and maintenance records. Lucas called from campus, frustrated that school kept him from being useful. They ate turkey and talked around the obvious fact that come February, if they hadn't found $72,000, First National Bank would start foreclosure proceedings and Frank would have exactly the opening he needed. December hit Iowa like a fist. Blizzard warnings went up the first week, temperatures dropping to 10 below, wind chill pushing -20. Sam and Ellie worked the machine shed, maintaining equipment in preparation for spring, their breath visible in the unheated space. The 4020 needed a clutch replacement. Sam handled it methodically, teaching Ellie as he worked, explaining each step like she might need to do this herself someday. She might. That was the reality neither of them said aloud. On December 15th, the 4430 quit during a routine check. Engines seized, hydraulics failed, the whole system going down in a cascade of mechanical failure. Sam diagnosed it quickly. Frozen fuel line had led to contamination, which led to engine damage, which led to $1,400 in repairs they couldn't afford. Ellie sat in the machine shed looking at the broken tractor at their primary field equipment dead in the middle of winter and felt the weight of impossibility pressing down. $1,400. They'd just paid $500 to Sam. The loan payment was due in 2 weeks. Operating costs kept grinding away at their reserves. She went to the house and wrote a check from their emergency fund, the account that was supposed to cover 6 months of expenses, but now held barely enough for 2. The check cleared. The tractor got fixed. The emergency fund dropped below $1,000. That night she sat at the kitchen table with the farm's financial records spread in front of her, adding columns that refused to balance. Income from fall harvest, $42,000. Operating costs, $31,000. Net, $11,000. Loan payments for the year, $6,840. Sam's salary through spring, $3,000. Tractor repair, $1,400. Equipment maintenance, $800. The numbers didn't lie. They were bleeding money faster than the farm could generate it. The letter from First National arrived December 18th, official bank letterhead, formal language that meant serious trouble. Dear Mrs. Bradford, This letter serves as 45-day notice regarding loan number 7834B in the amount of $72,000 due February 1, 1979. Given recent inquiries into your farm's viability and management structure, we must inform you that failure to pay in full will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings. Please contact our office to discuss repayment options. Ellie read it 3 times. Recent inquiries into viability and management. Frank had been talking to the bank. Frank was coordinating with them, laying groundwork, making sure they knew a 54-year-old widow was farming alone, making sure they understood the risk. She called Morrison that afternoon. His voice came through the phone, tired and honest. "I expected this. Frank is within his rights to inquire as partial owner, and banks can discuss foreclosure with interested buyers." "Interested buyers? You mean AgCorp?" "Likely. Eleanor, they're building a case. If you default, they'll argue the farm should be sold immediately to satisfy debts. Frank gets his share, Diane gets hers, AgCorp gets the land. What can I do? Pay the loan, or find enough to make them reconsider foreclosure." She hung up and stood in Will's office looking at files that held 32 years of farming history, of careful record-keeping of a life built on land that might not outlast winter. Christmas Eve brought all 3 children home again. They gathered around the same table, tried to maintain traditions that felt hollow. Without Will exchanged small gifts they'd bought with money none of them had to spare. The tree sat in the corner, lights blinking, ornaments from 3 decades of Christmases when the future had seemed certain. Garrett brought up selling again, gentle this time, approaching it like a necessary conversation instead of an argument. "Mom, you've proven you can farm this land. Everyone knows it now, but at what cost?" Ellie looked at her oldest son, saw Will's features in his face, his father's practical nature in how he approached problems. "What do you want me to do? Give up? Let Frank win? Let yourself survive. You've lost 12 pounds since Dad died. You're exhausted all the time. Mom, we don't want to lose you too." Claire reached across the table, her hand covering Ellie's. "Maybe there's middle ground. What if you hired more help, a full-time manager? You'd still own the farm, still make decisions, but you wouldn't be carrying everything alone. I have Sam. Sam's part-time. Mom, you need someone full-time, someone who can do the heavy work you shouldn't be doing." Lucas leaned back, his chair creaking. "We could help more. I could take a semester off." "No." Ellie's voice cut through the suggestion. "You stay in school. Education matters more than this fight. This fight is our legacy, and your education is your future. Don't sacrifice one for the other." They argued in circles, voices rising and falling, until Claire finally stood up and walked to the kitchen window. She stared out at snow-covered fields, at the machine shed where their grandfather had worked, at land that held 4 generations of Bradford history. When she turned back, her face showed a decision made. "What if I came back?" The room went silent. Ellie felt her heart lurch. "Claire, no. Hear me out. I could quit teaching, move home, help run the farm. 2 of us working it, we could—" "Absolutely not. You work too hard for that degree." Claire's voice stayed steady, certain in a way Ellie had never heard from her gentle daughter. "I worked hard on this farm too. Growing up, helping Dad, learning every field, every piece of equipment. Why is it okay for you to fight alone, but not okay for me to help?" Garrett started to speak, but Claire cut him off. "No, let me finish. I've been thinking about this since the funeral. Since I watched Mom disc 40 acres by herself while grieving. Since Frank showed up with his real estate agent. I don't want to lose this place. And I don't want to watch my mother destroy herself trying to save it alone." Ellie shook her head, her teacher daughter's sacrifice too much to accept. "You love teaching. I love this farm more. I always have." The admission hung in the Christmas-lit room. Lucas looked stunned. Garrett's engineer face showed he was recalculating everything. Ellie felt tears threatening and pushed them back. "Claire, you can't give up your career for this. It's not giving up. It's choosing. There's a difference." They argued until midnight, voices exhausted, positions unchanged. Claire insisted she was coming home. Ellie insisted she wasn't. The Christmas tree blinked through the tension ornaments, reflecting light that couldn't quite reach the darkness of what they faced. Finally, Garrett proposed a compromise. Claire keeps teaching through the end of the school year. She helps weekends and breaks. In May, we reassess. If Mom still needs full-time help, if the farm is viable, then Claire can make the choice with more information. Claire's jaw set stubbornly, but she nodded. Ellie wanted to keep arguing, wanted to protect her daughter from sacrificing anything for land that might be lost anyway. But exhaustion won. They agreed to Garrett's timeline and went to bed with nothing truly settled. The week after Christmas, Frank came back. No phone call, no warning, just his truck pulling into the farmyard on a gray December afternoon. Ellie was in the machine shed with Sam when she heard the engine. They came out together, Sam's presence a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. Frank got out of his truck, slowly looking at the well-maintained equipment yard, at the organized shed, at evidence that someone was running this operation competently. "Ellie, place looks good." "Thank you. I hear you hired help." "Sam Tucker, he's working out well." Frank's eyes went to Sam, assessed him, dismissed him as irrelevant. "So you couldn't do it alone after all?" Ellie felt Sam stiffen beside her, but his face stayed neutral. She kept her voice level. "I'm running a 320-acre farm at 54 years old. Hiring one farmhand doesn't mean I failed. It means I'm running a business smartly. Or it means you're admitting you can't handle this." "I'm farming Frank. The fields are maintained, the equipment works, everything's running. What more do you want?" Diane appeared from the passenger side of the truck, her discomfort visible in how she held herself. She looked at Ellie, at Sam, at the farm that had become a battlefield. "We're not here to argue. We came to make another offer." Frank pulled papers from his coat, unfolded them against the hood of his truck. "AgCorp is still interested. They've increased their offer to $500,000. Ellie, that's $50,000 over the original valuation." "I'm not selling. Just hear us out." Diane's voice carried something like pleading. $500,000. After debts and our shares, you'd clear about $290,000. That's enough to retire live comfortably, never worry about money or work or any of this again. Ellie looked at her sister-in-law, at Frank's wife, who'd stood silent through everything, who seemed torn between family loyalty and what was right. "I don't want to retire. I want a farm." Frank's patience cracked. "Why are you being so stubborn about this? You can't keep this up forever. Another year. 5 years. Eventually, you'll be too old, too tired. What happens then? Then I'll deal with it then. Right now, I'm farming and I'm doing it well." Charles Carlson stepped out from behind the truck. Diane's husband, who'd been silent at the first meeting, who Ellie had almost forgotten was involved. His banker's voice carried the weight of professional assessment. "Actually, Mrs. Bradford, we've been consulting with our own attorney. The partnership provision about mismanagement, it's broader than you might think." Ice formed in Ellie's stomach. "What do you mean? It's not just about whether you can farm the land. It's about whether you're maximizing its value. By refusing to sell when offered significantly over market value, you could be argued to be mismanaging the partnership asset. You're costing the estate money by turning down a profitable sale." The words hit like a physical blow. Ellie looked at Diane, at this woman who'd been silent and uncomfortable through everything. "You're going to sue me for not selling my own home." Diane's voice came out barely audible. "We don't want to. But Eleanor, if you force us to, we will." Frank's face showed something close to regret, but his voice stayed firm. "We're filing papers next week. Petition for forced sale based on mismanagement of partnership assets and failure to maximize estate value. I'm sorry, Ellie, you're leaving us no choice." They left. Sam stood beside Ellie in the farmyard, both of them watching taillights disappear down the county road. Snow had started falling again, light flakes that would accumulate into something harder to navigate. Sam finally spoke, his voice carrying decades of farming wisdom. "They're desperate. I know. Desperate people make mistakes." Ellie looked at him, at this man who'd agreed to work for half pay, who showed up every morning without fail, who'd become the anchor keeping her from drifting. "What kind of mistakes?" "The kind that show judges who's really trying to help and who's trying to profit." She called Morrison that afternoon. His voice came through tired but not surprised. "I expected legal action. Eleanor, this is going to get ugly." "Tell me what to do." "Farm this land better than it's ever been farmed. Document everything, every decision, every expense, every maintenance task. Prove you're not mismanaging anything. Show that the farm is profitable, well-maintained, operating successfully, and hope the judge sees this for what it is." "Will that work?" The pause told her everything. "I don't know, but it's your best option." January brought cold that made December seem gentle. Temperatures stayed below zero for 2 weeks straight. The farmhouse windows frosted on the inside. Pipes froze despite heat tape. Sam and Ellie worked the machine shed in layers of thermal clothes, their breath visible even with the space heaters running. But they kept working. Every piece of equipment got serviced, checked, rechecked. Every maintenance task got documented in logs Henry Morrison said might matter in court. Every decision got recorded with justification, building a paper trail that showed competent management instead of desperate survival. Claire drove home every weekend, stayed Friday night through Sunday afternoon, helped organize financial records and prepare documentation. She'd given notice at her school would finish the academic year in May, then move home permanently regardless of what Ellie said. The decision was made, and Claire's stubborn streak inherited from both parents meant arguing was pointless. Lucas came home for winter break, spent 3 weeks working alongside Sam and Ellie, learning equipment maintenance and field preparation and the 1,000 small tasks that kept a farm running. He'd switched his major to agricultural business, telling Ellie on Christmas that if they saved the farm, someone needed to know how to run it properly. If they lost it, he'd help other farmers avoid the same fate. Garrett handled the legal paperwork from Des Moines, coordinating with Morrison, gathering financial records that went back decades. He'd hired a photographer to take aerial shots of the farm, evidence of well-maintained fields and organized operations. The photos showed what Ellie knew but couldn't prove alone: this farm was thriving despite everything. The court date got set for May 15th. Frank filed his petition in late January, formal legal language about partnership obligations and fiduciary duty and maximizing asset value. Morrison filed a response arguing that a partnership owner couldn't force sale simply because another partner refused to accept a third-party offer, that Ellie had demonstrated competent management, that the petition was motivated by Frank's personal financial troubles rather than genuine concern for the estate. The legal fees started accumulating. $200 here, $300 there. Morrison's hourly rate adding up faster than Ellie had anticipated. By February 1st, she'd spent $1,800 on legal costs with months of litigation ahead. February 1st also brought the loan payment due. $72,000. Ellie didn't have it. The farm account held $11,000 after January expenses. Her personal savings had $3,000. The kids' combined contributions gave another $20,000. $34,000 total against a $72,000 obligation. She called First National on January 30th, asked to speak with the loan officer. Robert Hendricks came on the line, his voice carrying professional distance that said he'd handled foreclosures before. "Mrs. Bradford, I assume you're calling about the payment due tomorrow." "I can't pay $72,000, but I can pay $34,000 now with a plan for the rest." The silence stretched long enough that Ellie thought the connection had dropped. "Mrs. Bradford, the loan agreement specifies payment in full by February 1st. "I understand that, but I'm asking for an extension. The farm is profitable, well managed. I just need time." "I'm sorry, but given your current circumstances, farming alone at your age with significant partnership disputes pending, the bank doesn't see this as a viable long-term operation." Anger flared hot in Ellie's chest. "I'm not farming alone. I have an experienced farmhand. I have my children helping. The operation is running better now than it did when my husband was alive. Be that as it may, the terms of the loan are clear. Without full payment by close of business tomorrow, we'll begin foreclosure proceedings. Give me until spring harvest. 6 months. I'll pay down the principal, show you the farm can generate the revenue." Another long silence. Then Hendricks's voice came back with an offer that felt like a trap. "I can take this to my supervisor. If you can bring us $40,000 by close of business tomorrow, we'll consider restructuring the remaining $32,000 over 10 years at 9% interest. But that's our final offer, and it requires approval from the senior vice president. 40,000. 6,000 more than she had. Ellie's mind raced through options that didn't exist. I'll need to make some calls. You have until 3 p.m. tomorrow. After that, we proceed with foreclosure. She hung up and immediately called Garrett. We're 6,000 short. His voice came back strained. Mom, I'm tapped out. I've given you everything I can without destroying my own finances. Claire had the same answer. Lucas had nothing left to give. Morrison said he could loan $15,000, but Ellie had already borrowed too much pride to take from a man who'd given decades of legal service to her family. She sat at the kitchen table that night staring at numbers that refused to balance at a shortfall that would cost everything. $6,000. It might as well have been $6 million. Sunday morning she went to church like always. Pastor Ruth preached about community, about neighbors helping neighbors, about the body of Christ being many parts working together. Ellie sat in her usual pew and heard the words without processing them, her mind too occupied with impossible mathematics. After the service, Pastor Ruth pulled her aside. I heard about the bank deadline. Ellie nodded, too exhausted to pretend privacy existed in small towns. Tomorrow at 3. We're 6,000 short. Pastor Ruth's face showed something shifting, a decision crystallizing. The Women's Auxiliary meets Tuesday nights. We've been discussing how to help since Frank's lawsuit became public knowledge. Give me until tonight. Ruth, I can't ask the church. You're not asking, we're offering. Eleanor, you've been part of this community 32 years. You've helped with every fundraiser, every potluck, every funeral dinner. That means something. Sam Tucker found her in the fellowship hall as people were leaving. His wife Martha stood beside him, both of them with faces that said they'd made a choice. I heard you talking to Pastor Ruth. Bad news travels fast. Good news travels faster. I'm donating my next 2 months' pay. That's $1,000. Ellie started to protest, but Martha cut her off. Will Bradford helped us when we needed it. This is just paying forward what we owe. Through the afternoon, word spread. The Women's Auxiliary organized an emergency bake sale set for that evening, spreading news through phone trees that reached across 3 counties. By 6 p.m., tables filled the fellowship hall with pies and cakes and cookies, prices deliberately high, people buying not because they wanted dessert, but because they wanted to help. The bake sale raised $847. The church collection that morning after Pastor Ruth's sermon about community brought in $3,200 specifically designated for the Bradford Farm Fund. Individual donations came in through the evening, $50. Here $100, there $200 from a farmer who remembered Will fixing his combine at midnight before harvest. By midnight they'd raised $5,600. Combined with Sam's donated salary, they had $6,600. Close. So close. Still $400 short. Monday morning at 8 a.m., a check arrived at Ellie's mailbox. No return address, no note, just a cashier's check for $1,000 made out to Eleanor Bradford. She stared at it, at the anonymous generosity, at proof that someone in this community cared enough to give from their own pocket without needing recognition. She called Garrett. We have it. $40,400. His voice came back choked. How? Community, church, people who remember what it means to help. At 2:30 p.m., Ellie walked into First National Bank of Iowa with Morrison beside her and a bank bag containing $40,400 in cashier's checks and money orders. Robert Hendricks looked genuinely surprised when she slid the bag across his desk. Count it. He did twice, his expression shifting from professional distance to something like respect. This is real. Did you think I'd give up? He processed the payment, printed receipts, had her sign restructuring documents for the remaining $32,000. The new terms showed 10 years at 9% monthly payments of $402. Manageable. Barely, but manageable. Outside the bank, Morrison gripped her shoulder. That was remarkable. That was community. Either way, you bought yourself time. Now use it to win in court. February became March. snow melting into mud frost, breaking its grip on frozen earth. Sam and Ellie prepared equipment for spring planting, servicing tractors and checking seed drills and making sure everything would work when the ground dried enough to accept seed. Claire came home every weekend, had started staying Sunday nights and Monday mornings, calling in sick to her teaching job more often than she should. Her principal had been understanding, had known her parents had granted flexibility that wouldn't last past the school year. But Claire was already mentally gone, already transitioning from teacher to farmer, her mind calculating planting schedules instead of lesson plans. One Friday night in late March, sitting at the kitchen table reviewing seed contracts, Claire looked up from the paperwork. "I'm not going back after May." Ellie had known this was coming, but hearing it stated made it real. "Claire." "Mom, stop. We've had this argument a dozen times. I'm coming home. This is where I belong. You worked too hard for that degree, and I'll use it. Teaching farm kids how to read isn't that different from teaching this land how to produce. Different classroom, same principle." She paused, her hands flat on the table. "Dad's gone. You can't do this alone, not long term. Sam's great, but he's part-time and he's 47. He won't be able to do heavy labor forever. You need family here. You need someone who'll care about this land the way you do." Ellie felt tears threatening and pushed them back. "I don't want you to resent this choice someday." "The only thing I'd resent is watching us lose the farm because I was too proud to help." They worked in silence after that, reviewing contracts and seed orders and planting schedules for 220 acres of corn and 100 acres of soybeans. The work filled the space where argument had been, both of them finding comfort in practical tasks that had definite answers. April brought the first warm days, soil-drying temperatures climbing into the 50s and 60s. Planting season arrived with its compressed timeline and long hours, and the particular intensity that came from knowing a whole year's income depended on getting seed in ground at exactly the right moment. Sam, Ellie, and Claire worked dawn to dusk, running tractors in shifts, planting corn across 220 acres in 10 days flat. The seed went in perfect, the weather held, the equipment ran like Will had always maintained it flawlessly, because failure wasn't an option. Lucas came home for spring break, worked 70-hour weeks alongside them, 19 years old, and proving he could handle farming as well as any man twice his age. Garrett drove down on weekends, took over bookkeeping and financial tracking so Ellie could focus on field work. The family operated as a unit, each person filling gaps, the others left building something that felt sustainable even while knowing the court case could destroy everything. By the third week of April, all the corn was in. The soybean planting went faster, 100 acres done in 4 days. They finished on a Thursday evening, the last row planted just as the sun touched the western horizon. Sam shut down his tractor and climbed down, stood looking at 220 acres of planted corn, 100 acres of soybeans, 320 acres of Bradford land showing perfect rows of future harvest. Ellie and Claire joined him, all three of them filthy with field dust and diesel stains and the particular exhaustion that came from doing impossible work. Claire spoke first, her voice carrying wonder. "We did it. We did." Ellie looked at her daughter, at this young woman who'd given up teaching to farm, who'd sacrificed career for legacy. "Thank you. Thank me when we win in court." The court date loomed 3 weeks away. Morrison had been preparing evidence, gathering testimonials, building a case that Frank's petition was motivated by personal financial desperation rather than legitimate concern for the partnership. He'd subpoenaed Frank's business records, discovered the hardware store was indeed failing, found evidence of debts that made Frank's need for this farm sale obvious and desperate. Garrett had collected neighbor statements praising the farm's condition. Pastor Ruth had written a character witness letter. Sam had prepared professional assessment of the operation's management quality. They had aerial photographs showing immaculate fields, financial records proving profitability, documentation of every decision Ellie had made since Will died. The case they'd built looked strong on paper. Whether it would survive actual court remained to be seen. On the last Friday of April, Morrison called Ellie into his office for final preparation. The trial was scheduled for May 15th, 2 weeks away. He spread documents across his desk, evidence arranged like ammunition for a battle. "We're ready. Frank's attorney will argue you're mismanaging the partnership by refusing a profitable sale. We'll argue that partnership law doesn't allow forced sales simply because one partner wants to liquidate assets. We'll show competent management, profitable operation, and Frank's personal financial motivation. What are our chances? Morrison's old lawyer face showed honesty earned through decades of delivering hard truths. 60-40 in our favor. Maybe 70-30 if the judge sees through Frank's desperation, but Eleanor, nothing's guaranteed. You need to prepare yourself for the possibility we lose. If we lose, the farm gets sold, debts paid first, then partnership shares distributed. You'd walk away with about $270,000 after everything. And if we win, you keep farming. Frank and Diane retain their partnership shares but can't force a sale. You'd still owe them eventual buyout when you're ready to sell, but that could be years from now. Ellie nodded, processing outcomes that both felt like versions of losing. Winning meant keeping the farm, but never truly owning it completely. Losing meant everything gone turned into cash that couldn't replace what had been taken. There's one more thing. Morrison pulled a final document from his desk. I've been researching Frank's hardware store. It filed for bankruptcy protection last week. He owes $120,000 to creditors. Eleanor, this man is drowning financially. This farm sale is his only lifeline. The information settled over Ellie like cold rain. Frank wasn't evil. He was desperate. A man watching his life's work collapse, reaching for anything that might save him, even if that meant destroying his brother's widow to do it. She drove home that evening thinking about desperation, about how financial ruin made people do things they'd never consider otherwise. Frank had ignored Will in hospice, had shown up 5 days after the funeral with a real estate agent, had sued his own sister-in-law. Not because he was heartless, but because he was terrified. Understanding his motivation didn't make it hurt less. But it made the fight feel different somehow, less about good versus evil, and more about two families trying to survive in a world that crushed farmers who couldn't keep up. The May planting was done. The fields showed green shoots pushing through soil, corn and soybeans beginning their journey toward harvest. The farm ran smoothly, profitably, exactly how a well-managed operation should. In 2 weeks, a judge would decide if any of it mattered. Ellie sat on her porch that evening watching the sunset paint the western sky in colors that reminded her of every sunset she'd watched with Will over 32 years. The land stretched out before her, 320 acres of Bradford history of work and sacrifice and stubborn refusal to quit. Whatever happened in court, she'd done everything possible, farmed the land impeccably, built a team that worked, proved a 54-year-old widow could manage 320 acres not just adequately but well. The rest was up to judges and lawyers and forces beyond her control. She went inside as darkness fell, closed the door on another day of surviving, and began preparing for the trial that would determine everything. The 2 weeks before trial passed in a blur of preparation and ordinary farm work that felt surreal against the coming judgment. Morrison drilled Ellie on testimony, taught her to answer questions directly without volunteering information that could be twisted. Clare reviewed financial documents until she could recite profit margins from memory. Garrett compiled a timeline showing every decision Ellie had made since October, each one justified and documented. Sam kept farming because crops didn't care about courtrooms. The corn stood knee-high by mid-May, soybeans emerging strong, both showing the kind of growth that promised good harvest. He worked the fields while the family prepared for battle, his steady presence a reminder that regardless of legal outcomes, the land still needed attention. The night before trial, Ellie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the house settle, thinking about Will and how he'd never intended to leave her fighting his family in court. He'd meant to fix the partnership, meant to pay off the debt, meant to have time for all the things cancer had stolen. His intentions didn't matter now. Only the fight ahead mattered. She rose at 4, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table watching dawn break over fields she might lose despite doing everything right. Clare found her there an hour later, both of them too nervous to eat breakfast, both dressed in clothes that felt like costumes for a performance neither wanted to give. The Fairfield County Courthouse sat on Main Street, red brick and white columns built in 1893 when Iowa was still finding its identity. Ellie climbed the steps at 8:30, Morrison beside her, Clare and Garrett flanking them like guards. Lucas had driven down from Ames, stood waiting inside, wearing a suit that made him look older than 19. The courtroom smelled like old wood and furniture polish, and the accumulated tension of decades of disputes settled under law. Judge Catherine Walsh presided from an elevated bench, 60-something and gray-haired, her face showing the neutrality judges learned to wear like armor. She'd been on the bench 17 years, had a reputation for fairness and intolerance for nonsense. Frank sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a Des Moines lawyer named Richard Baxter, who specialized in estate disputes. Diane sat in the gallery behind Frank, her face showing discomfort that had only deepened since October. Charles Carlson sat beside his wife, banker's face revealing nothing. Morrison had explained the process: opening statements, witness testimony, cross-examination, closing arguments, then Judge Walsh's decision. No jury in civil cases like this, just one woman weighing evidence and determining who deserved what. Baxter stood for his opening statement, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd argued hundreds of cases. Your Honor, this case concerns a partnership agreement established in 1962 when 3 siblings inherited farmland from their father. The agreement clearly states that major decisions require majority consent. My client Franklin Bradford owns 68 acres of this partnership. His sister Diane owns 44 acres. Together they represent 35% ownership. The defendant Eleanor Bradford controls the remaining 65% through her deceased husband's estate. He paced his movements, calculated for effect. Since William Bradford's death, Mrs. Bradford has refused multiple offers to sell the property, including one significantly above market value. She has rejected reasonable buyout proposals. She has operated the farm in a manner that prioritizes her personal attachment over the partnership's financial interests. This isn't about capability or sentiment. This is about legal obligation to fellow partners. We're asking this court to enforce the partnership agreement and order sale of the property to maximize value for all stakeholders. Morrison rose for his response, his 71 years showing in how carefully he stood, but not in the sharpness of his voice. Your Honor, this case is about a desperate man trying to profit from his brother's widow. Franklin Bradford's hardware store filed bankruptcy last month. He owes creditors over $120,000. He needs money, and he's decided his sister-in-law's home is where he'll get it. He let that sink in before continuing. Partnership law doesn't allow forced liquidation simply because one partner wants cash. Mrs. Bradford has demonstrated exemplary management of this farm. She's profitable, current on all obligations, and operating the land better than it's been operated in years. The only mismanagement here is Mr. Bradford's attempt to use a partnership agreement as a weapon against a widow who's done nothing wrong. Judge Walsh's pen scratched across her notepad. Mr. Baxter, call your first witness. Frank took the stand, swore to tell truth, settled into the witness chair with visible discomfort. Baxter led him through the partnership history establishing the 1962 agreement. Will's partial buyout over the years, the current ownership structure. Mr. Bradford, why are you seeking to enforce the partnership agreement now? Frank's answer came out rehearsed. Because the farm represents significant value that's being wasted. Will always said when the time came we'd sell to someone who could farm it properly. He knew Ellie couldn't manage 320 acres alone. This sale is what Will would have wanted. Morrison's cross-examination cut through the careful presentation. Mr. Bradford, when did you last visit your brother before he died? Frank shifted. I visited him in hospice. Once, for 20 minutes. Is that correct? I have a business to run. A business that's now bankrupt. When did you file for bankruptcy protection? Last month. And how much do you owe creditors? Frank's jaw tightened. About $120,000. Morrison pulled documents from his file. Your projected proceeds from this farm sale would be approximately $160,000, enough to clear your debts with money left over. That's convenient timing. Objection. Relevance. Baxter stood quickly. Judge Walsh glanced at Morrison. Sustained. Mr. Morrison, establish relevance or move on. Your Honor, the timing establishes motive. Mr. Bradford isn't acting out of concern for the partnership. He's acting out of personal financial desperation. Noted. Continue. Morrison turned back to Frank. In the 7 months since your brother died, how many times have you visited this farm? 3 times. 3 times. And each visit was to pressure Mrs. Bradford to sell, to discuss options. Did you ever offer to help her buy her groceries, maintain equipment, anything that might support your claim of family concern? Frank's silence answered louder than words. Morrison pressed harder. In fact, you went to the bank that holds her loan and expressed concerns about her viability as a farmer. You coordinated with AgCorp Holdings to ensure they'd be ready to buy if she failed. You've been building a case for her failure since before Will was even buried. I was protecting the partnership's interests. You were protecting your own interests. No further questions. Diane took the stand next, visibly reluctant, her hands folded tight in her lap. Baxter handled her gently, establishing her ownership stake, her agreement with Frank's position, her belief that selling was the right choice for everyone. Morrison's cross-examination was brief and pointed. Mrs. Carlson, do you need money from this farm sale? No. My husband and I are financially stable. Then why support this lawsuit? Diane's voice came out barely audible. Frank is my brother. I thought I was supporting him. Do you believe Mrs. Bradford is mismanaging the farm? A long pause. Judge Walsh leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Carlson, please answer. Diane's voice cracked. No. The farm looks better now than it did when Will was alive. No further questions. Baxter called Douglas Reinhardt, the real estate agent who testified about market values and AgCorp's offer. Morrison's cross-examination established that Reinhardt stood to make a $20,000 commission on the sale, giving him financial motivation to see it happen. When Ellie took the stand just before noon, the courtroom felt smaller. Somehow the weight of 7 months compressed into this moment. Morrison led her through her story, methodically building a narrative that showed competence instead of desperation. Mrs. Bradford, please tell the court about your farming experience. Ellie's voice came out steadier than she felt. I've been on this land since 1946, 32 years. I helped Will with bookkeeping from the beginning, managed finances, coordinated planting and harvest schedules. I drove equipment when needed, hauled grain, did whatever the farm required. After Will got sick, I took over more responsibilities. By the time he died, I already knew how to run the operation. What happened the first week after his funeral? I started farming. Disked 3 fields by myself, proved I could do the work. Were you successful? Yes, the fields got done on time, done right. When did you hire help? November. Sam Tucker, an experienced farmer from the neighboring section. He works alongside me, handles heavy equipment operation while I manage the business side. Morrison pulled out financial records, walked her through numbers that showed profitability, careful management success by every measurable standard. In your professional opinion, as someone who's farmed this land 32 years, is the operation being mismanaged? No. We're profitable current on all obligations and the land is producing better than it has in years. Baxter's cross-examination came at her hard. Mrs. Bradford, you're 54 years old. How much longer can you physically do this work? As long as I need to. That's not an answer. 5 years, 10. I don't know the future. I know I can farm today and tomorrow and every day until I can't. But you've admitted you can't do it alone. You hired help within a month. Ellie's response came swift and sharp. Hiring skilled help is good management, not admission of failure. Even when Will was alive, we occasionally hired additional workers during harvest. That's standard practice on any properly run farm. You've lost significant weight since your husband died. I've lost 12 pounds. I'm still healthy and capable. You're exhausted all the time. I'm farming 320 acres. Exhaustion is part of the job. Baxter changed tactics. Mrs. Bradford, AgCorp has offered $500,000 for this property. That's $50,000 over market value. By refusing this offer, aren't you costing the partnership significant money? The partnership isn't a corporation that exists only to maximize profit. It's a family farm that's been worked for 4 generations. Value isn't just measured in dollars. but legally partnership assets should be managed for maximum benefit to all partners. Ellie looked directly at Judge Walsh when she answered. I'm managing this partnership by keeping the land productive and profitable. If Frank needs money, he can sell his 68 acres to someone else. I'll work with any new partner who actually wants to farm instead of liquidate. But I won't sell my home just because my brother-in-law made bad business decisions and needs a bailout. Judge Walsh's eyebrows rose slightly. Morrison smiled. Baxter looked momentarily thrown before recovering. No further questions. Clare testified next, explaining her decision to return to farming, describing the operation's success, making clear this wasn't a desperate widow barely hanging on, but a thriving family business with next-generation commitment. Sam Tucker took the stand after lunch, his farmer's credibility carrying weight. Baxter tried to shake his assessment, but Sam's answers were rock solid. The farm was well-managed equipment, properly maintained fields, showing excellent results, operation running as good or better than any in the county. Morrison called neighbors who testified to the farm's condition. Pastor Ruth, who spoke to Ellie's character Garrett, who presented financial analysis showing profitability and sound decision-making. Document after document, witness after witness, building an overwhelming case that Frank's lawsuit had nothing to do with partnership interests and everything to do with personal financial need. Closing arguments began at 3 o'clock. Baxter tried to reframe everything around legal obligations and fiduciary duty, arguing that sentiment couldn't override partnership law, that reasonable offers had been rejected, that forced sale was the only way to protect all partners' interests. Morrison's closing took 20 minutes, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. Your Honor, this case should never have reached your courtroom. Franklin Bradford wants money. His business failed. He owes creditors, and he's decided his brother's widow should pay for his mistakes. He's using a partnership agreement as a weapon, twisting legal language to justify taking a woman's home 7 months after she buried her husband. He gestured toward Ellie. Mrs. Bradford has done everything right. She's farmed the land successfully. She's profitable. She's hired good help. She's made sound business decisions. She's proven that a 54-year-old widow can manage 320 acres not just adequately, but exceptionally well. The only mismanagement here is Mr. Bradford's attempt to liquidate a productive farm for personal profit. His voice dropped, became quieter, but somehow more powerful. Partnership law exists to ensure fair treatment among business partners. It doesn't exist to let desperate men steal from widows. Eleanor Bradford deserves to keep her home. This court should tell Franklin Bradford to solve his own financial problems without destroying his sister-in-law in the process. Judge Walsh's pen moved across her notepad for a long moment after Morrison sat down. The courtroom held its breath, everyone understanding that decades of precedent and hundreds of thousands of dollars hung on whatever she was about to say. Finally, she looked up, her face still neutral, but her eyes showing she'd made a decision. I've reviewed the partnership agreement. I've considered the testimony. I've examined the financial records. Mr. Baxter, your client, has established that a valid partnership exists and that he holds a minority stake. What he hasn't established is grounds for forced liquidation. Frank's attorney started to speak, but Judge Walsh raised a hand. Partnership law allows partners to petition for dissolution under certain circumstances, fraud, abandonment, fundamental disagreement about operation. But simply wanting to cash out isn't grounds for forced sale, especially when the managing partner is operating the business successfully. She flipped through documents on her bench. Mrs. Bradford has demonstrated competent management. The farm is profitable, well-maintained, and operating at a level that meets or exceeds industry standards. Her decision to decline a sale offer regardless of price doesn't constitute mismanagement. It's her right as majority partner to choose continuation over liquidation. Ellie felt Clare's hand grip hers under the table. Judge Walsh continued, her voice taking on an edge. Furthermore, I find the timing of this lawsuit troubling. Mr. Bradford showed minimal involvement in his brother's life before death and minimal support for Mrs. Bradford after. His bankruptcy filing 1 month before initiating this lawsuit suggests his motivation is personal financial need rather than genuine concern for partnership welfare. She closed the file in front of her. The petition for forced sale is denied. Mrs. Bradford retains full management authority over the farm. The partnership agreement remains in effect. Mr. Bradford and Mrs. Carlson retain their ownership stakes, but no sale will be compelled. Additionally, I'm ordering Mr. Bradford to pay Mrs. Bradford's legal fees in the amount of $6,200. Court dismissed. The gavel cracked once. Frank's face went white. Diane looked relieved. Charles Carlson stood quickly pulling his wife toward the exit. Baxter gathered papers with the tight movements of someone swallowing defeat. Ellie sat frozen for a moment, the word "denied" still echoing in her head. Morrison's hand settled on her shoulder. "You won." Clare burst into tears. Garrett pulled them both into a hug. Lucas let out a whoop that earned a stern look from the bailiff. Sam Tucker, watching from the gallery, nodded once with the satisfaction of someone who'd known all along how this would end. Outside the courthouse, spring sunshine felt warmer than it had any right to. Frank and Diane moved toward their separate cars without speaking to Ellie, without acknowledging what had just happened. Frank's face showed the kind of defeat that came from losing everything in one afternoon. His lawsuit, his credibility, his last hope of saving his failed business. Ellie watched him go and felt something complicated settle in her chest. Not triumph, not vindication, just the heavy knowledge that she'd survived something she should never have faced, and winning didn't erase the cost of having fought at all. Morrison stood beside her on the courthouse steps. "Go home. Farm your land. Live your life. Frank can't touch you now. He still owns 68 acres. Yes, but he can't force you to do anything with them. Someday you'll buy him out, or you'll sell when you're ready, but that's on your timeline, not his." The drive back to the farm took 15 minutes. Ellie followed Garrett's car, Clare beside her in the passenger seat. Both of them quiet with the kind of exhaustion that came from surviving something traumatic. The corn was growing. The soybeans looked strong. The land stretched out exactly as it had that morning, unchanged by courtroom drama, indifferent to human conflicts, waiting patiently for whoever would work it. They gathered in the farmhouse kitchen, all five of them, Ellie, Clare, Garrett, Lucas, and Sam, who'd followed them home. Someone opened beer, even though it was only 4 in the afternoon. They sat around the oak table and let the reality sink in that they'd won, that the farm was safe, that 7 months of fighting had ended with justice instead of catastrophe. Lucas raised his bottle. "To Mom, who proved everyone wrong." They drank. Ellie felt tears finally coming, the ones she'd held back through trial, through testimony, through the judge's decision. Clare put an arm around her and they cried together while the men looked uncomfortable, and Sam quietly slipped out to do evening chores because work didn't stop for victories. That night, Ellie lay in bed listening to the house settle, thinking about Will and how he'd worried she couldn't handle this alone. He'd been wrong, or maybe he'd been right, and she'd become someone different through necessity. Either way, the farm was safe. The land would keep producing. The legacy would continue. Sleep came easier than it had in 7 months. Summer arrived with its rhythm of growth and maintenance and the endless small tasks that kept a farm running. The corn grew tall, soybeans filled out both crops, showing the kind of development that promised good harvest. Clare finished her teaching contract in late May, moved home permanently in June, became full partner in the operation she'd chosen over career. They worked together through hot July days, mother and daughter side by side on tractors in the machine shed, coordinating with Sam on cultivation and pest management and the 1,000 decisions that farming demanded. Lucas came home for summer, worked 3 months straight, learning equipment maintenance from Sam, studying agricultural business in the evenings, building knowledge he'd need whether they kept this farm or helped others avoid losing theirs. August brought county fair and reminders that life existed beyond survival. Clare went with friends. Her age came home talking about Tom Peterson, a neighboring farmer's son, 27, and good-looking and interested. Ellie watched her daughter blush and remembered being 23 and falling for Will Bradford, remembered how love felt when it was new and uncomplicated by loss. Harvest arrived in October, exactly 1 year after Will's funeral. Ellie stood in the East 40 on October 16th, watching Sam and Clare run combines through mature corn, listening to diesel engines and grain augers, smelling the particular scent of harvest that meant another season survived. She'd been a widow 1 year. The farm had made it through that year profitable and intact. Some victories were measured in survival. The corn yielded 145 bushels per acre, good for the year, better than expectations. Soybeans came in at 41 bushels per acre, slightly below average but acceptable. Gross income hit 61,000, operating costs 33,000, net profit 28,000. They'd not only survived, they'd thrived. The bank payment went through on time. Sam's salary got paid without scrambling. They bought a used grain truck to replace one that had finally died after 22 years. The farm account showed positive balance for the first time since Will's diagnosis. Modest but real proof that widows could farm and children could come home and land could keep producing regardless of who worked it. The years that followed blurred together in the way successful years do, each one building on the last without crisis to mark them as distinct. 1980 brought a second profitable harvest. Clare and Tom Peterson married in the spring of '82, small ceremony at First Methodist reception in the church basement. Tom moving to the Bradford farm because it had more acres and better equipment. Ellie watched her daughter marry and felt the particular satisfaction of seeing next generation choose farming when they could have chosen anything. Tom was good with equipment, patient with land, smart about markets. He and Clare worked together with the easy partnership of people who shared both bed and business, their marriage strengthened by mutual purpose. The first grandchild arrived in '83, a girl they named Sarah after Will's mother. Ellie became grandmother at 59, held this tiny person who represented 5 generations on Bradford land, who might someday farm these same fields or might choose something else entirely. Either way, the land would be here. Sam Tucker worked the farm through 1987 before age and bad knees forced partial retirement. He stayed on as consultant, teaching Tom the tricks Will had taught him, passing knowledge that couldn't be learned from books. Ellie transitioned management to Clare and Tom, gradually moving from active farming to advisory role, her body grateful for the shift even as her mind sometimes missed the intensity of running everything. By 1990, at 66, Ellie was grandmother to 3 farmer emeritus women who'd proven that widows could survive what everyone said would destroy them. The farm grossed $180,000 annually under Clare and Tom's management, modern equipment, and better practices, increasing productivity while maintaining the core principles Will had established decades earlier. The land mattered, the work mattered, debt was slavery, and ownership was freedom. 1993 brought Frank Bradford's death at 77. Heart attack sudden and final, sparing him the long decline cancer had forced on Will. Ellie attended the funeral at the same First Methodist church where they'd buried Will 15 years earlier, sat in the back because Frank's children didn't know her well enough for front row seating. Diane approached afterward, older, now her husband dead 2 years, her face showing the accumulation of regrets that came from choosing wrong and knowing it. "Eleanor, I'm sorry. For all of it. I should have stopped him." Ellie looked at this woman who'd stood with Frank through the lawsuit, who'd owned 44 acres of Bradford land for 31 years without ever once visiting to see how it grew. "We both did what we thought we had to do. You were right, and I was wrong. We were both desperate, different kinds of desperate, but the feeling was the same." They stood in church fellowship hall, drinking bad coffee, 2 women who'd been sisters-in-law for 47 years without ever really being family. Diane left that afternoon, drove back to Des Moines, died 3 years later, having never returned to Fairfield. Her 44 acres passed to her children, who sold to Clare and Tom for fair market value, finally consolidating ownership that should have been consolidated decades earlier. Henry Morrison died in '95 at 88, his funeral packed with 3 decades worth of clients he'd represented honestly. Ellie spoke at the service about loyalty and integrity and lawyers who cared more about right than about winning. Morrison had saved her farm through competent representation and careful research. She owed him everything that came after. Sam Tucker followed in '97, 76 years old and worn out from lifetime of farm labor. His funeral drew every farmer in 3 counties. Men who'd worked alongside him, learned from him, respected the particular knowledge that came from doing one thing well for 50 years. Ellie stood with Claire and Tom and the grandchildren and said goodbye to the man who'd helped save their farm when saving it seemed impossible. By 97 at 73, Ellie's body was telling her what her mind already knew. Time to step back completely. Time to move to town. Time to let the next generation have the house and the land and the future. She called Claire and Tom to the kitchen table one April evening, the same table where every important conversation had happened for 45 years. "I'm ready to sell you the farm." Claire's face showed she'd been expecting this, but hoping it wouldn't come yet. "Mom, listen first. The farm's worth about $820,000 now. Land values have gone up, equipment's been upgraded, everything's in good shape. I could sell at market price, maximize my return. But that's not what I'm going to do." She pulled out documents she'd prepared with the help of Morrison's successor, a young attorney named Sarah Chen, who'd taken over the practice. "I'm selling to you and Tom for $600,000. That's $220,000 below market. You can afford the loan with farm income, and you'll have equity from day one." Tom started to protest, but Ellie raised a hand. "Will and I started with almost nothing. Someone gave us a chance when we needed it. This is me giving you the same chance. The farm's yours. Build something your kids can inherit the way you inherited from us." Claire was crying. Tom looked overwhelmed. Ellie felt the weight of 51 years on this land settling into something lighter, something that felt like completion instead of loss. The sale closed in June. Ellie used the money carefully, $85,000 for a small house in town close to Church and Main Street, walking distance to everything she needed. $200,000 into college funds for the 3 grandchildren, ensuring they'd have education regardless of what farming looked like in the future. $100,000 divided between Garrett and Lucas, both of them established in careers but grateful for help with mortgages and children's futures. The remainder, $135,000 into retirement accounts that would fund her final years. Moving day came in late June, hot and humid, the kind of Iowa summer day that made working outside feel like swimming through air. Claire and Tom helped pack boxes, load furniture, transport a lifetime of accumulation from farmhouse to townhouse. Ellie walked through empty rooms one last time, touching walls that held memories of raising children and grieving husband and fighting for survival and winning despite everything. The kitchen was hardest. That oak table would stay too big for a townhouse, perfect for Claire and Tom's growing family. Ellie stood looking at it, at Will's chair, which had stayed empty for 19 years, at the place where she'd learned her husband had hidden debt, and where she'd decided to fight Frank, and where she'd celebrated courtroom victory and harvest success and ordinary Tuesday dinners that accumulated into a life. Claire found her there, standing motionless in the empty kitchen. "This will always be your home." Ellie shook her head, her voice steady. "No, honey, it's your home now. Mine is in town, and that's how it should be." The house on Elm Street was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom kitchen, barely big enough for a table. But it had a porch for sitting and watching the world go by, and neighbors who waved in the mornings, and the church 3 blocks away, close enough to walk, even when winter made walking hard. Ellie settled into town life with the same determination she'd brought to farming, finding purpose in women's auxiliary meetings and helping at church functions and being grandmother to children who visited after school. The Bradford farm thrived under Claire and Tom's management. They expanded to 380 acres through careful leasing. Modernized equipment raised their children to understand farming as both business and calling. Ellie visited once a week, had Sunday dinner at the farmhouse, consulted on major decisions when asked, but mostly just enjoyed watching next generation build their own version of what she and Will had started. The years from 97 to 2011 passed quietly. Ellie aged the way people do when they've fought their battles and won enough to find peace. Her body slowed, her hair went completely white, her hands developed arthritis that made small tasks difficult. But her mind stayed sharp and her spirit stayed strong, and her satisfaction in having saved the farm never diminished. Sarah, Claire's oldest daughter, decided in 2008 to study agricultural economics at Iowa State, following in Lucas's footsteps, choosing farm life over easier options. Ellie watched this great-granddaughter and saw the cycle continuing, saw Bradford blood choosing Bradford land across 5 generations. The morning of March 3, 2011, Ellie didn't wake up. Claire found her at 10, called from the house on Elm Street, her voice thick with grief. Ellie would have understood better than anyone. 87 years old, 51 of them on the Bradford farm, 19 as a widow who refused to quit, 14 in town, watching her legacy flourish. Death came quietly in sleep, which was more mercy than many received, more peace than Ellie had given herself in the hard years after Will died. The obituary ran in the Fairfield Ledger and Des Moines Register, simple language for a complicated life. Eleanor Bradford, 87, died peacefully, March 3rd at her home. Farmer mother, grandmother, great-grandmother. She proved that a widow could do what no one thought possible. Survived by daughter Clare Peterson, sons Garrett and Lucas Bradford, 3 grandchildren, 7 great-grandchildren. Funeral services Friday at First Methodist Church. The church packed beyond capacity, standing room only, people spilling into fellowship hall to listen through speakers. The same sanctuary where Will's funeral had drawn 237 drew 350 for Ellie, testament to 51 years of showing up and working hard and refusing to let anyone tell her what she couldn't do. Claire spoke through tears about her mother's courage. Garrett talked about her business sense. Lucas described her determination. But it was Sarah, the great-granddaughter, who captured what mattered most. Great-grandma Ellie buried her husband on a Monday. By Friday, his family tried to take everything she'd built. She could have given up. She could have sold. Instead, she fought. She farmed 320 acres at 54 years old when everyone said she couldn't. She hired good people. She made smart decisions. She won in court. Then she farmed for 18 more years before selling to my parents at below market price because giving the next generation a chance mattered more than maximizing profit. Sarah paused, her young voice carrying across the packed sanctuary. She gave the farm to my parents. My parents will give it to us. We'll give it to our children. The land stays in the family because great-grandma Ellie refused to let it go. That's her legacy. Not the acres or the equipment or the profit margins, but the proof that fighting for what matters is always worth it, even when the fight seems impossible. They buried Ellie in the Bradford family plot beside Will. Her headstone simple. Eleanor Bradford, 1924 to 2011. Beloved wife, mother farmer. The land endures. The farm she'd saved remained family-owned. Claire and Tom working it through their 60s, training Sarah and her brother to take over eventually. The same 320 acres Will's grandfather had homesteaded in 1901, plus the 60 acres Tom's family had added, all of it still growing corn and soybeans, still producing profit, still proving that farms could survive transitions from one generation to the next if the people loved the land more than they feared the work. The kitchen table Will built in 1952 still sat in the farmhouse. Claire's grandchildren ate breakfast there, spilled milk on the oak surface, did homework at the same place where Ellie had reviewed farm accounts and fought Frank's lawsuit and made the 1,000 small decisions that accumulated into success. The wood was scarred now, marked by decades of use, but solid, still built to last the way everything Will had built was meant to last. On warm October afternoons, when harvest ran late, when the combines worked until sunset, and the corn came in good, and the year looked profitable, Claire sometimes stood in the fields her mother had fought to save and felt the weight of that fight settling into gratitude. Ellie had been 54 when Will died, had looked at 320 acres and impossible debt and family betrayal, and had chosen to fight rather than surrender. That choice rippled forward through time. Claire farmed because her mother had refused to quit. Sarah would farm because her grandmother had built something worth inheriting. The land produced because someone had cared enough to keep it producing when every force pushed toward sale and surrender and the easier path of walking away. The legacy wasn't just land. It was the proof that one woman's refusal to accept defeat had changed everything that came after, had determined the shape of decades she would never see, had given her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren the most valuable inheritance possible. Not money or property, but the knowledge that fighting for what matters is never wasted effort, even when winning seems impossible, even when the cost feels unbearable, even when everyone says, "Let it go and save yourself the pain." Eleanor Bradford had buried her husband on a Monday in October of 1978. His family had tried to take her farm by Friday. She'd fought for 7 months and won. Then she'd farmed the land for 18 years, raised crops and grandchildren, proved every doubt wrong, and finally sold the farm to her daughter at below market price because legacy mattered more than profit. The land she'd saved would outlast everyone who fought over it. But the memory of how she'd saved it, the story of the widow who refused to quit, the knowledge that ordinary people could survive extraordinary battles if they refused to surrender, that would outlast even the land itself, passed down through generations, who would farm or not farm, but who would always know they came from someone who'd fought when fighting seemed futile and won when winning seemed impossible. That was Eleanor Bradford's true harvest. Not the corn or soybeans or dollars per acre, but the unbreakable knowledge that home was worth defending, that family was worth fighting for, and that a 54-year-old widow could prove the whole world wrong if she just refused to believe what everyone said was impossible.